I wrote about Marie Bjelke-Petersen, writer of popular romantic novels set in Tasmania in the 20th century, Jane Franklin, governor's wife in the 1840s, and Maria Risley, a convict who arrived in 1805 and by her business acumen made a fortune. Bjelke-Petersen was born in Denmark in 1874 and emigrated to Tasmania in 1891 when she was 16. Her brother gave classes in fashionable gymnastics, and Marie assisted him until he went to the mainland. She continued to teach until bad health forced her to turn to writing romantic novels, with 9 published between 1917 and the Second World War. They were so successful that she was treated as a leading Australian writer. One, Jewel Nights, was filmed. The novels are valuable today, not so much for their highly romantic and sentimental love stories, but for the Tasmanian settings, closely observed by Marie Bjelke-Petersen, who loved travelling and describing people she met. This odd juxtaposition of these two themes comes to a climax with a couple kissing passionately on top of horizontal scrub way above the ground. Bjelke-Petersen left few personal writings. Some of her sentiments are apparent in her novels, for example, disliking pretension and snobbishness. But to sell her books and make a living, she had to keep within the limits of the expectations of her readers, which must have been fairly lowbrow considering the banality of the books. So she didn't depict women as rebels, but as conventional heroines as seen in the earlier 20th century, and unfortunately still now really, women looking for heterosexual love and fulfilled by finding it. To understand Bjelke-Petersen, the author must look at her own life. She was the only girl in a family of boys, with a dominant father and an obedient, womanly mother whom Bjelke-Petersen adored. She was expected to perhaps have a brief career, but more importantly, fall in love with a man and marry him. She was engaged to a man briefly, but said this was the most unhappy period of her life and broke off the engagement. After her mother died, she didn't housekeep for her father, as was expected of daughters, but lived independently with her lover, Sylvia Mills, visiting her father occasionally. Her novels provided a good income. After Sylvia died, Marie wished to die also, but rallied and lived with a group of women in a house with a large garden. Whether she had a sexual relationship with any of them is not clear. One was still there, living in the house when I wrote the book in the 1980s. Miss Sheila Cook, unintellectual but gentle, kind, hospitable, very helpful, and a devout evangelical Christian. I visited her a number of times, was shown everything, told everything, treated to everything she knew, treated to magnificent afternoon teas. It was a biographer's dream in every way but one. She was too nice, too innocent. I wanted to ask her about the sexual orientation of the group, and the question hovered right on the tip of my tongue, but I could never actually bring myself to say the words. I'd chide myself ferociously when I went home and tell myself that next time I had to, but I never could. I can imagine the reaction, either anguished horror or a gentle, "What does that mean, dear?" Bjelke-Petersen lived independently of men as much as she possibly could. She was a tall, commanding woman with a rather queenly bearing, accustomed to getting her own way, though never raising her voice or acting in an unseemly fashion. She liked her brothers, but was in no way subservient to them. Men she had to deal with, such as publishers and lawyers, were kindly but firmly instructed what to do, and they did it. Publishers did refuse to accept her books after the Second World War, when fashions in writing had changed dramatically, but by then Bjelke-Petersen was in her 70s and moved relatively easily to dignified retirement. Another aspect of her life was that she too was a devout evangelical Christian, in an unusual way, not attending a church, but having her own religion involved in a deep, intense personal relationship with God. She also believed, apparently, in fairies, leaving notes for them in the garden. All this was foreign to me, and it was difficult to take seriously, especially the fairies. I felt I could only report on it and leave it at that. I'm not sure this was the best way to deal with such material. It's part of the subject of the biography, and one should try to understand all aspects of one's subject and understand implications. But still, the fairies were a bit much. When I wrote the biography 30 years ago, I was constrained, partly by the attitude of the times, but mainly by Sheila Cook's attitude. I was very young. This was among my earliest work. I didn't want to offend her and wrote about Bjelke-Petersen's lesbianism in a more guarded way than I would now. It was pointless, and she was very offended anyway, and I had an irate phone call from her who thought I was most ungrateful after all she'd done for me. I was lucky to be able to speak to one who was so close to Bjelke Petersen, but it was unfortunate that I allowed myself to be influenced by her. I also didn't emphasise Bjelke Petersen's independence enough. This was in the 1980s. I would write a different book today. Jane Franklin was quite different. Ever since a hagiographic biography was published in 1951, she has been venerated as a woman ahead of her time, a great achiever and feminist, keen to promote women's education and help female convicts. One of her great admirers had transcribed all her diary entries and letters written in Tasmania, all 800,000 words, a huge task. She very kindly allowed me to use this enormous file, and I was very grateful, but it was the Miss Cook situation again. For her, Franklin was wonderful, not to be criticised. However, reading these diary entries, I came to dislike the woman. They were all about her, up to 10,000 words a day. Very little about her husband, hardly a mention of her stepdaughter, even less about Mathina, the Aboriginal girl she took into her house. Though, to be fair, her writings were ruthlessly culled and everything that might have reflected badly on her was removed, so perhaps the originals did contain more. I forced myself to temper this dislike. Aren't all diaries about their writers? Is it fair to judge people from their diaries, which presumably they want kept private? She never sought publication. And Franklin was living in the early to mid-19th century, a time when women were expected to confine their activities to home, charities and church. She was an intelligent, extremely competent woman. Today she could have been CEO of a multinational. She had little interest in the usual womanly topics: clothes, food, servants, children, domesticity, and the accomplishments, art, embroidery, or music. Most women, indeed most people, like at least one of these, but not Franklin. She was not really interested in women, far preferring men's company. She yearned to achieve but had little opportunity. How were such women expected to fit in with Victorian life? They just had to. Can one blame her for resorting to stratagems and wiles to get her own way? To be absorbed with herself and her gifts, which she must have known she had, but couldn't use? As the childless wife of the Governor of Tasmania, who adored her and never tried to limit her, she did have unusual scope for activity. She made the most of her chances. She set up a settlement in the Huon for those she felt ignored, poor but industrious free settlers. Most such organised settlements failed, not Franklin's. She set up a botanical garden and built a Greek temple to be used as a museum. She and her husband, but I think mainly she, established a scientific society at which people presented papers, which Franklin edited and published in a much admired journal. She strongly encouraged the establishment of a superior boys' school. All these activities were laudable by anyone's standards and very unusual for a woman at the time. But she was not a feminist. It's clear from her writing that she didn't like women and did nothing for them. She did not encourage their education. Her own stepdaughter retained the governess, thought only just adequate when she was 12, for another 7 years. Franklin is admired for her interest in female convicts, but when you actually look at it, what she wanted for them was harsher treatment, bringing them to a sense of their sin, with more harsh punishments, for example, cutting off their hair. Fortunately for the convicts, even the Conservative Convict Department of officials demurred at this. And Franklin's treatment of Mathina was appalling. She took the girl into her home, not out of kindness, but out of a desire to see what happened when whites tried to civilise a black girl. Franklin thought that her skin was getting lighter as she was civilised. I mean, it's just awful reading and writing about this material. When Mathina rebelled in fits of temper, Franklin became tired of her, and when the family left for England, she happily left her behind. Mathina now had no one. Franklin's adoption of her had alienated her from her own race, and owing to her colour, she could never fit in with white society. She had no one to look after her and lived very miserably. Jane Franklin had no sympathy for Aborigines, seeing them as scientific curiosities. She agreed with a dinner guest who also had no sympathy with the idea that it was shocking that they were disappearing. Franklin wrote, "I thought it was more as specimens of natural history that they were regretted than for anything else." This attitude was quite acceptable to her, but it's abhorrent to modern readers, and actually it's really difficult to read this stuff aloud. In writing about it, the biographer has to tread a fine line between understanding her subject, fitting her in with the ideas of the time, but dealing with an idea that has become absolutely abhorrent. So Jane Franklin was by no means the progressive woman that many of her admirers see her as. She was conservative, sure her own way was right, happy to help people she liked, but on her own terms. They had to toe the line. Perhaps it would have been astonishing to expect anything else from the British upper class of the 1840s, which Jenny's already just spoken about. It fits in very neatly. Even though they were English, I think that the experience of being upper class united them to a large extent, expecting to rule and expecting everybody else to obey. Jane Franklin was formed by growing up in this environment and acted out her upbringing. I liked, or at least respected, Mary Bucher Peterson. I disliked Franklin and was appalled by some of the things she did. But writing the biography brought home a truism. You don't have to like your subject. You're under a moral obligation to be fair, to try to see the world from their point of view, but you don't have to fall into the belief that people, especially women, have to be nice. This is a real trap. A major problem with the biography was practical. Jane Franklin wrote about 8 million words that are extant. When her family returned to England, she led the charge trying to find a husband when he disappeared, trying to find the Northwest Passage. I had a limit of 80,000 words, which had to include childhood, pre-Tasmanian activities, activities in Tasmania, then home to Britain and the search. It was very difficult to prune it down to 80,000 words. In fact, heartbreaking. Every word had to count to have a task in the book. But it's better for it, I realise now. And since then, I've read many books which would have been much better had they adhered to a tough word limit. Different entirely again was Maria Risley. The main problem here was a lack of personal information. For her pre-contact life, I had her date and place of birth, and 20 years later, that she was tried for theft 50 miles to the south. Yet in a biography, a life must be explained, a plausible narrative must be suggested. I had to milk every possible piece of information. Again, this is much what Jenny was saying in the first paper. Her father and mother were illiterate, signing documents with a cross, but her father was employed by the parish to mend the church roof and called Mr., which shows some social standing. Her mother had 7 children and all survived, unusual at that period. They were baptised in different churches around an agricultural district. Her brother talked of being taught farming as a boy. Maria was the eldest daughter. As an adult, she was intelligent and impatient. She would have been the same as a girl. So it was a farming family, probably tenant farmers since they moved round, or even labourers. If they'd owned a farm, they would have stayed there. Not desperately poor with that Mr., but working class, illiterate. All children surviving suggests a careful mother and a reasonable standard of living. The eldest daughter would have had to help her mother. This clever, impatient girl must have been bored stiff. Her sisters married local men, but she went south to escape, but was caught thieving a huge amount of goods. In a factual biography, one cannot assert possibilities, but one must suggest them. Risley was transported to Sydney, where female convicts were assigned as domestic servants. She became pregnant, probably not by choice. She was back in the female factory. Edward Lord came from Hobart looking for a woman and chose her. Why? She was heavily pregnant. There must have been something. After she had the baby, which was passed off as his, they all returned to Hobart. As a serving officer, Lord could not engage in trade, so he put Risley in charge of his shop. She turned out to be a brilliant businesswoman. Like Franklin, today she could have headed a multinational with one hand tied behind her back. Somehow, at a time when no upper-class officers married working-class criminal convicts, Risley inveigled Lord into marrying her. I enjoyed inventing 3 flights of fancy, dialogues which showed how she might have done this. Almost entirely by her efforts, the pair now built up a thriving shop in Hobart, ran sheep and cattle on 2 large properties, owned 3 ships used for trading, whaling and sealing, and through Edward's contacts, enhanced their fortune by a vast amount of bribery and corruption. Maria also bore him 6 children. However, Lord was a frustrating partner. No businessman, he forgot to send invoices to tell her what he'd done. He gambled away their money and made frequent trips to England, taking the children back to be trained as ladies and gentlemen away from their convict mother. Not surprisingly, Risley rebelled, and at the age of 40, when he was away, took a 20-year-old lover. That did it. Lord returned to England, where he lived with a second Mrs. Lord and a second family. Back in Hobart, Risley opened her own shop, made a fortune, and enjoyed the 2 children left in Tasmania, who provided grandchildren. Edward Lord was a sprig of the aristocracy, arrogant, entitled, hot-tempered, bullying, without his wife's intelligence, stamina, or resolution. How did Risley cope with such a man? The available evidence gave no hint. Kate Grenville discussed this topic in A Room Made of Leaves, a fictional account of Elizabeth MacArthur coping with a similar husband. With difficulty, but successfully, was her answer. Again, I used a flight of fancy to suggest that Risley, a clever woman, used subtle persuasion, presenting herself as meek, obedient, even silly, so that Edward could feel he was superior. Imaginative scenes are not strictly allowed in biographies. These were headed Flights of Fancy, printed on different coloured paper, obviously my own interpretation. Some readers liked them, purists disapproved. I liked Risley. I found stories about her in newspapers after Edward left, helping sick friends, exploring the distant wilds, a place in the Central Highlands too difficult for the delicate female foot to reach except Mrs. Lord's, attacking an intruder who was trying to steal her servant's belongings and catching him. Falling in love with your subject is another trap for biographies, but if you're aware of the possibility, you can hope to stop yourself turning your subject into an infallible hero. Bjelke-Petersen, Franklin and Risley were all strong, determined women, and I have a nightmare. I die and arrive at the pearly gates, and there they are, the 3 of them, in an implacable line. Well, you got that bit wrong. On another topic, one of the ideas to be suggested at this seminar is how to decolonialise Tasmanian history. I'm interested in this, but not sure entirely what it means. I discussed it with historian friends, and I'd be really interested in the points of view of other people. I'm sorry it's not part of really of this panel, but it is a very fascinating idea. Thanks.